Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription.
I'm glad you brought that up because it keys to the issue of why should employers care about diversity. And sometimes it's viewed as an issue of being woke, as our friend in Florida likes to emphasize. And in fact, to some people, the idea of diversity equates to the very essence of what it means to be woke. But we do know from the research that's been done that diversity issues tie to well-being in the workplace. And we have a global problem with mental issues affecting the population. They came to a head during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
When many people were trapped at home, many of them with no friends, no family, no relatives. They were isolated by themselves, and suicide rates, not just in the United States, but worldwide, skyrocketed. So one thing employers need to care about is the well-being of the workforce. And if they don't, then they should be prepared to see skyrocketing employee benefits costs.
So welcome to HR Talk, Unpacking Trends and Talent Innovation. We have an esteemed author, speaker, and distinguished professor at Penn State University, Dr. William J. Rothwell, and I'm Farhan Sadiq, your host, and our guest with us, Dr. Jamie Campbell, an Associate Dean for Diversity Enhancement Program at Smil College of Business, and he's a certified diversity executive as well. So please welcome Dr. Jamie Campbell. So today's topic is From Diversity to Belongings, HR Role in Shaping Inclusive Workplace. As the landscape of workplace continues to shift, so does the benchmark for inclusivity and equity. In today's episode, we are charting the transition from diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and adding belonging into the mix, giving rise to DEI&B. We will dive into emerging trends, dissect the implication of human resource, and explore how this new paradigm is revolutionizing the way companies approach and talent and culture.
Let me just begin the discussion by saying that this podcast is focusing on our recent book, Rethinking Organizational Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, that I did with Jamie Campbell and with Philip Ely. When we reviewed the material literature out there on diversity, one of the things we noticed was that there was a tendency not to take a very systematic approach to the implementation of organizational diversity programs or DE&I programs. And so what we decided to do is use organization development as a point of focus. We developed a special model that's included in the book on how to implement the major change effort involved with DE&I. So that's basically what we and our co-authors, our contributing authors, were setting out to do with this book. So that's a little bit of a backgrounder on what we're talking about today. So in terms of how do we go about defining diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
So the idea is when we talk about diversity, remember diversity at its best simply means difference. It simply means recognizing those qualities in individuals, whether it be what you can see, what you can hear, how you sound, and that's before you go through all of the race and ethnicity and all of those pieces. But just the simple differences. When we speak to equity, we want to talk about making sure that things are, the first part of that word, equal. Everyone has something level to work from. You know, a lot of times when you use this, you'll see the picture of the three kids. Each of them has a different box, but it's to their ability to make it fair across the board, making it a level situation. Now, people often confuse equity with equal with equality. It's just because they all sound the same, but they actually are three totally separate and different words. So you have to work through that. So sometimes that takes a little bit longer to work through. But when we talk about inclusion and belonging, those are probably some of the more difficult pieces. Because you say if you include someone, then they belong, but that's not necessarily what we're saying. With inclusion, we're bringing people to the table. We are allowing them to be a part of the group. We're allowing them to, quote unquote, speak. And the reason why I say, quote unquote, speak is because you can speak but not be heard. When you're engaging in belonging, though, they're at the table now and they feel like not only can they speak, but they're being heard and they're being engaged and listened to. So belonging kind of extends on what inclusion is. You hear people talk about inclusion meaning asking people to a dance. But then when you belong, you're now playing their music. So it's just those different pieces. So hopefully that was the quick 30-second version, but it's each one, you can't do one without the other. Each one has to build within. It's almost a Lego version of understanding what DEI&B actually stands for and means and how they interrelate together. And then the last piece of this that we didn't really talk about here was the accessibility piece. And we can talk about that at another point. But that accessibility, making sure that we're looking out for folks with different ability, different engagement, making sure access is there for everyone.
Jamie, do you have any thoughts about why it might be strategically important to define these terms from an organization's specific viewpoint?
Yeah, no, I think it's important to define them primarily because of culture. We understand that within organizations, as you understand how all of these terms change and this lexicon grows, it becomes important to say, what are we defining? Who are we as an organization? And so you want to be careful on how you put out all of these phrases and all of these words because they don't mean the same thing to everyone. And you want to make sure that your organization isn't just using them interchangeably just at face value. So one of the terms that I heard an organization use, and I'm trying to get how they define it, was they used it, and I'm going to probably steal it because they didn't say I couldn't. So, but they turned it to IDEA, right? Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And I thought that was unique because it's changing the framing of how it's phrased, right? And so when you talk about DEI, we had a friend in Florida who constantly talks about DEI&B and says, well, this is how this should be framed. And he turned the words to be more advantageous to him. So, but we can now say idea. People can get mad at ideas, but they can accept ideas. It's about making so that not only is it palatable for everyone being engaged, but also making sure that it still reflects what you are and giving power and strength to these words because they do have that. And so as we grow, we're adding on different pieces, different words. Remember, diversity just started as diversity. If you look at how it started, because it went from multicultural to diversity. And then we went to equity, then we went to inclusion, then belonging, now we're at accessibility. So when organizations are looking at these changes, also it will depend on the social change, depend on cultural changes, but it'll be how we engage with these words and what comes next. So I think it's very important to pay attention to all of this because as these things change, the organization is going to grow. And then, Doc, when you pointed out neurodiversity, for a long time, we were leaving folks who are neurodiverse out of this equation. Like we might have included it a little bit with stuff that we were aware of, like when we talked about bipolar disorder, but then we said, oh, well, that's not, we shouldn't be including autism in that because that's not the same. But these are folks who actually can engage in the workspace. Everyone can engage in a workspace. And it's not just about making a building accessible. It's about people with seasonal affective disorder, making sure that they have proper lighting, things like it's little things you can do in the workspace that makes your workers, not just those who are affected with these issues, but those who are not affected with these issues, feel like, oh, this organization cares about me. This organization is engaged with, if they're engaged with Jamie, well, how are they going to take care of me? And then the organization, the culture, and then the culture begins to change that this is truly a caring organization that's not just putting it in their 5x10 glossy. And I got the you're glossing me from Ken Boyer. Ken Boyer is the head of EWATCH Foundation, and he always says, when you're giving me diversity stuff, don't gloss me. Don't just give me the warm and fuzzy. Give me what's sincere, and your employees will see that. So if they're taking care of Jamie with his seasonal affective disorder, Farhan might say, well, look, I've got these issues or these concerns. And let's not say issues, let's just say concerns that allow them to grow in the workplace, but feel more comfortable about it. Because like you mentioned, Doc, a lot of folks won't even talk about their mental issues in the workspace because they're afraid of the stigmatism. They're afraid of being stigmatized with these problems.
All right.
But if they see these little things being done, they now become more engaged. And this comes back to the idea of the talent development. They become the more engaged worker, and they're not quiet quitting, or they're not loud quitting. Either way, they're engaged in the space.
I'm glad you brought that up because it keys to the issue of why should employers care about diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's viewed as an issue of being woke, as our friend in Florida likes to emphasize. And in fact, to some people, the idea of diversity equates to the very essence of what it means to be woke. But we do know from the research that's been done that diversity issues tie to well-being in the workplace. And we have a global problem with mental issues affecting the population.
Mm-hmm.
They came to a head during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
And many people were trapped at home, many of them with no friends, no family, no relatives. They were isolated by themselves, and suicide rates, not just in the United States, but worldwide, skyrocketed. So one thing employers need to care about is the well-being of the workforce. And if they don't, then they should be prepared to see skyrocketing employee benefits costs as their insurance has to pick up the tab for all of the consequences of ignoring well-being issues like drug abuse, alcohol abuse, suicides, and many other kinds of problems that can come up as a direct consequence of ignoring well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And from an employer's standpoint, I'm glad you brought up the issue of quiet quitting, which is a problem of engagement,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of the great resignation, which keys to higher than historically normal turnover rates and absenteeism rates, because the two of those are related.
Absolutely.
So those are some of the reasons employers should care about diversity.
Mm-hmm.
The reasons why you would talk to a tough-minded manager who might think that all HR efforts are a big waste of time and money.
Right.
If you're trying to justify it to them, you would bring up these issues of turnover costs,
Mm-hmm.
absenteeism costs, in what happens when people are actively disengaged and set out to sabotage their own employers. And that costs us time, money, and effort that could be better directed elsewhere. Jamie, do you have any other thoughts on why we should care about diversity?
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of MYCPE to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
Well, I think, Dr. Rothwell, I think you actually touched on many of them, because when you talked about the tough-minded manager, right, who doesn't necessarily believe in diversity or thinks that we're all diverse and we have diversity of thought, so it's okay. So you have to look at things like, for those folks, you have to go right at them where they are, right? You go to their pockets. So you start talking about the business case for diversity, and they may say, I get it, but how do we, what difference does it make? Well, when you start saying that the business case for diversity increases your market share, and if you can have more diverse people on your workforce, you now have the ability to go into different markets. You now have the ability to look at segmentation and then begin to say, you know what, we're missing this. And for those tough-minded managers, Just start talking about the trillions of dollars of spending power that each of these groups have. And don't forget the LGBTQIA community when you're talking about these ideas of spending power. You're talking about at least 1 trillion in some cases, close to 1 trillion in other cases. And if you say you're willing to miss this because you don't want to diversify your workforce, why are we in business? It's one of the reasons why I like being in the business college. Because when we speak about diversity, they get to that point, at some point, they'll say, well, what does this matter if they can't produce? Well, I want the best people on my team. I want to make sure not only do I have the best people inside, but front facing also. So when we go out to the companies that are diverse, because we also know during the pandemic that you brought, like when you brought up the pandemic, we also know that women and minority folks in underrepresented backgrounds are some of the highest people to become entrepreneurs out of this pandemic. They were already large. But when we started facing like Momageddon, folks started working and creating all of these businesses. How are we going to just send males or men into these women-oriented business who can say, oh yeah, I have your best interest at heart? They want to see diverse teams. How are you going to miss out on these clients because you're saying, I don't get it? And yes, we know one of the issues with diversity is we always talk about metrics. Even in doing research on it, it's always, well, we can't define it. What's the return on investment? Because tough-minded managers want results like they get with other product. This is not the same type of thing. We know that diversity, what was it? It takes a year to set up a diversity office, 1 year. But to start seeing diversity results, it can take 3 to 5. And if you're saying in year 2, I'm not seeing enough, well, you haven't begun to shift the culture, right? So the example, of course, is the Titanic. And I hate using the Titanic, maybe say the Queen Mary, because the Titanic sank. Diversity is not going to sink. We have to figure out how to adjust and turn so we miss icebergs, so we understand what's above the water and what's below the water. And usually the presenting problem isn't as much as the underlying problem, because then you start to talk about who's starting to feel like things are being taken from them. But we're in business. We're in the business to beat literally the other person, not just the other guy, but all of them. We want the full market share. So if you're not utilizing the business case for diversity effectively, then a manager could say, well, we tried and it didn't work. Well, how are you trying? Are you just bringing people in and saying, okay, you'll sit there and you have a quote unquote token person in that? Or are you really engaging them? And Doc, I know I'm talking way more time than you expected, but
Okay.
to use the idea of business and looking at like Black hair care, right? I have 3 daughters, so I'm going to stick with that because I know how much money I spend on that. But the idea of how is that marketing to this group? And you can't just say, oh, well, we can give them one product. That's not the case. Everything is different. Everything is done different. And if you're sitting around a table, like if you look at like the Gucci's and the Doves and the Abercrombie and Fitch and the Starbucks, who are saying, yeah, we're going to shut down for a day to talk about diversity. Oh my goodness, we're going to do better. That still doesn't help the people like Cheerios who are doing the same mistakes over and over again. So we have to be able, with those tough-minded managers, to talk about bottom lines and not always approach it from a warm and fuzzy. Because diversity isn't easy work. It's not supposed to be. That's why it's work. It is supposed to be engaging. It's supposed to be changing. And change, we know, is hard. And so we're dealing with different structures, different cultural values, different time frames. Remember, in the workspace, we've got over 5 different generations in the workspace. How many people are saying, well, it wasn't like that in my day? How many people are saying, oh, I'm not used to that? How many are saying, well, I couldn't have children because it wasn't expected? Why are you expected to take off? How are you so open at work? With those tough-minded managers, we have to be able to explain all of these, give them the diversity case, and then also show them how it'll help in the long run. And so it may not be in a year time. It's something that you have to do over time. And the organizations that are doing this with some emphasis, they're seeing these turns over time. It's not a quick hit, but it is that I'm going to get all the market share. I'm going to capture this side. I'm going to be able to engage in this space. So I like the idea of the tough-minded manager because they can't be approached from the altruistic, the philanthropic. This is good for you. No. This is good for your pocket. This is the what's in it for me. This is why you should do it. So they get that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it keys to 2 issues that we should mention. One of those is the idea of business impact and measuring not just in dollars and cents or economic terms, But the balanced scorecard thinking looks at the company's strategic goals from 4 quadrants and defines success as not just short-term profitability, but long-term issues like market share, long-term issues like business efficiency, and the learning and growth of the organization as a whole. So diversity keys to that bigger definition of what it means to have a successful organization. We can come up with metrics for that, but it's hard work. And it drives us past the immediate return on investment style thinking to the bigger notion of measuring business impact. And that takes us into talking about not just the world inside the company, but also our position within a larger community, a larger region, an industry, a nation, a global framework. So that's important to measure success and realize we can measure it in more than one way. Organization development, which I mentioned as bottom-up change, is particularly well aligned with the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, because in OD, we believe that the people are the experts. It's democracy in the workplace, and we want to hear all voices. That's very much aligned with the principle of diversity, equity, inclusion, belongingness, accessibility, and other things we might mention. So we prize diverse thinking, and we prize it because the world is headed toward an innovation-based economy. And that's often one of the justifications of diversity efforts. You touched on this, Jamie, that very often we're serving more than one customer base. And if we focus on just one profile of a customer, then we're going to miss the many other customers that we may have been appealing to and selling to and making money from. So we have to be aware of that. So Jamie, how do you think these concepts relate to each other if we're talking about an organization? How do we talk about integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do we put all of those puzzle pieces into a box so that it makes sense to people who are trying to sort it out?
So I think how you sort it out, it starts at the base level. It starts and we talk about this bottom-up approach, right? Because we're always trying to get at that frozen middle. But when you get it within the culture, when you start bringing it in, and it is about that vocabulary, it is about constantly saying this is a part of it. And it's not an overnight, but it is about how you write things. How is your company giving information to new people when they come in? How are you being seen and perceived outside of it? Because again, when you're taking in new workers, they're looking at how is the company view? What does the company do? Because they don't understand the internal culture. They understand the external culture, but they want to really get more involved and more into it. I want to use the example of the NFL when they started marketing more toward women, because they had been doing all of these big jerseys for the longest time. And somewhere somebody got the bright idea that women may want different fits on their jerseys. And so they began to talk to them, but that engagement took a long time. Even if you look at the environmental piece, we're now all looking at climate change. And I know climate change, you may think, doesn't have anything to do with diversity, but if you talk about it appropriately, sustainability is a big part of organizations. With the population changing, remember, we're talking about like 2046, the census said it flips. 2025, they said more underrepresented students will be in the classroom than ever before, actually outpacing their white counterparts. Now we have to begin to say, how do we look? How do we feel? How do we do this within the organization? It means from the very beginning. And so if you're looking at how we look at climate change and pulling out electric cars, we start to talk about sustainability. Who's going to be in our ranks? We now have to look at how we do and how we increase our managerial programs. How are those programs going to change? If we start that when the person hits the door, when Farhan walks in for the very first time and has people to say, hey, how are you? And giving him acceptance around everything from him being him to his holiday, to his holidays, to his faith. How do we get engaged? If that's done when they walk in the door and it's meant sincerely, I'm not talking about one organization that decided to create an ice cream around a holiday. I'm talking about when it's done sincerely and respected. Individuals then know, and we're starting to change culture. You start to change it with the new people, you'll get the bottom up approach, you'll get that middle thought. So when companies are doing these things, it is about that vocabulary, because the leadership will always say, this is what we should be doing. But it's the people on the line that actually have to really live it every day. And it's those people in the middle, the managers, that have to enforce it. So we begin to change this culture. It is a process. And I keep going to the word culture, not climate, but culture. Because culture and climate are even things that we talk about in diversity, and some people use them interchangeably, and they're not. Culture is who we are. The climate is what we're doing, how we feel. And so it's important to engage both of those in every step of the organization. If folks on the bottom and folks on the lower rungs feel like the company cares, when they become managers, they will take that with them. When they become senior folks, when they get into the C-suite, they'll remember that. And so at each step, it has to be pushed in. It has to be forced in. You have to breathe it, live it, drink it, eat it every day. And so I think this is how we accomplish getting that in. Because again, and I want to go back to the hard manager, HR is always going to say, here is what it is. And diversity can't just be compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity has to be that acceptance. Diversity has to be that necessity. Because we can comply all day and still not get it. You can have the organization can have that 90% rating from the EEOC and still be a horrid company.
Right.
We have to be able to get the folks when they come into the door to begin those changes there.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
Thank you, Dr. Well, we are really discussing some very important part of the facts, and we just talked about changing the culture, and HR plays a crucial role in DEI initiatives by shaping the organization culture. They can help policies and procedures, and they actually help the top management to make the right decision and make it more clear and unbiased as they hire new employees. So we want to know more about how the role has been changed or evolved historically in relation to DEI initiatives.
So small history lesson. When we talk about things like the civil rights movement, because everybody always equates the civil rights movement to everything else, I want you to understand that Montgomery bus boycott that we talk about with Dr. King so often, if you look at it at its base level, it was about business. People stopped taking the bus. The bus company actually almost went out of business. There's several books on it, like The Bearing of the Cross, which gives you the whole SELC creation. But they almost went out of business because they didn't expect the African-American people in Birmingham to just say, we're not going to ride, we're going to walk. And you all know how hot it gets in Alabama in the summer. We're going to deal with this. We're going to deal with this. Almost a year's time, they said, we're going to do it. The company themselves said, hey, we're going to change. It was the folks in power that said, no, they're tearing at our fabric. But the company said, we need to change because we want to stay in business. You look at how the civil rights movement then advanced. Then they said, if you look at selective patronage, which you talk about a lot with boycotts, people began to change because they said, oh, people aren't coming in. They aren't buying our product. No matter how much people on the outside said, this is something we've got to change. And no matter how many of the organizations said, we're not going to change, those organizations went out of business. The organizations that began to change then said, okay, here's what we're looking at. Even when it pertained to women or folks in the LGBTQIA community, as things changed when they got up and said, nope, this is what we're going to do. We're going to boycott until this happens. And if you look at what's going on now, from the strikes, where we're talking about wage discrepancy and how these payrolls do, or if you look at Lilly Ledbetter, because that really was the law that enacted talking about how we look at how we pay people, right? Because it was just about with her act, it said you no longer could do it right then and there. You now had 180 days from the last check you got. So when you're talking about this historical perspective and this historical content, look at how the social change then provided each movement, each thing as it came about. And even with the passing of the Civil Rights Act and all of these things, it wasn't because, how do I say this? Nope, there's no nice way to say what I'm getting ready to say. It wasn't just because they saw it as a good thing. They saw it as a necessity because this is what the people were calling for. These were what voters were calling for. And we all know politicians want to stay in their seats. So if they're calling for it, they're engaged in it. Now they're saying, okay, we got to make these changes. Even with my good friend, Jeff Sessions, right? When he said, no, Title IX does not apply to all of these folks, it made us look at it. And it made us rethink the word sex and gender, because it didn't, in Title IX, there's no orientation, right? But it says we had to think about it because as people, we said, no, it changed, but he went at the word itself. So even though it was the wrong thing, it was the right thing because it helped us to understand. And even though they got that, the court got that one right. It was just about that engaging. So as we talk about this historical perspective, each time people ground up, remember OD, right? Ground up. We said these things we cannot abide by. We said we're not going to go along with this anymore. Dr. Rothwell mentioned Coca-Cola. Mm-hmm. Folks said, you know what? Y'all are still in South Africa. And I know it's an old example, but it's probably one of the most powerful. Coke said, oh, that's money. We're not losing that. In South Africa, because people in America said, nah, we're going to divest. People all over the world said, that's wrong, get out. If you look at currently what was going on in Ukraine, McDonald's, they stopped selling hamburgers. Have you ever thought of McDonald's saying, we're not going to sell a hamburger? They stopped selling hamburgers because they said, hey, this is wrong. And I'm equating these things to how people move, not necessarily diversity, but just how people move, the perception of these things. Mm-hmm. So as you engage in this, yes, it's always this historical perspective. And we talk about what we celebrate now that we didn't celebrate 20, 30 years ago. We didn't celebrate Pride the way we're doing it. And I think today actually is Coming Out Day. We didn't celebrate this maybe 40 years ago the same way we celebrate it now. We didn't celebrate Juneteenth the same way we didn't celebrate it now. All of these things came because people said, this is what we want to do. And companies said, there's something in it. We can market to this. And I know I'm being as brass tacks as possible about it, but business is business. How can we neglect this? How can we go around this? How can we say we're not going to be involved? And it only takes one company. Because when one company does it, they start getting a hold of market shares, the other companies follow through. And it's not that this is just an evil, because I do believe that many of the businesses believe in what they're doing. But when we're talking about those hard managers, those folks that say, I can't see it, I don't understand it. Like we talked about my buddy in Florida. You start to look at the news reports that are coming out about how much money Florida is losing. Mm-hmm. You start to hear people quietly grumbling and saying, wait a minute, this is now affecting me. Well, now we'll see what happens. Because now you start to see that group getting smaller. You start to see these things making changes. You start to see academics saying, wait, this is wrong, I'm leaving. You can't run a business. You can't run a state when folks are saying, I don't want to be there. So we make changes, we make these efforts, but this historical perspective always leads with people, small groups of folks gearing up and staying in the fight. It can't just be a one-off, oh, we got what we wanted. Because if you look at the wheel of diversity, there's always an issue, whether it be immigration, whether it be women's pay, whether it be LGBTQIA, whether it be mental health. We have to stay committed and bound together in this effort.
What do you think? I mean, affirmative action in the early days forced employers to think about this. Mm-hmm. Some of them interpreted it as a goal or goals that had to be met. Mm-hmm. So that was a way of managing risk. Other companies went into it in a big way so that they would get a free publicity pop.
Right. We're trying to get to the point where we don't have to worry about a government regulation because what we do in the organization is so sound that whatever they tell us, we're already doing. And we know it takes the government eons to move. So if we can get ahead of it, and getting ahead of it goes back to this bottom-up, top-down approach, right? We get ahead of it because someone is going to have a fault with each way you do it. If you overcompensate, then someone is going to say, oh, you overcompensated because you're looking at this, you're not remembering me. And if you talk about how we look at especially with white males, especially in today's culture and climate, where they say, oh, I'm being left out, you're forgetting me. It's not the case. When we talk about diversity, white males are in this diverse group. They can be low socioeconomic, they can be first gen, they can have so many different aspects of it. But when they focus on just race, not ethnicity, but just race, they pull themselves out because they don't understand the concept of diversity. And I'm not saying all, but just some in this instance. But when organizations see it, they say we don't want to get sued, right? Because we know how big these lawsuits win. And 9 out of 10, or really, I think it's like, if memory serves, I think it's like 6 out of 10. The plaintiff usually wins or settles, which means the company still has to pay a tremendous amount to say, okay, we're going to comply, right? So there's the idea of good trouble, like getting sued for doing the right thing.
Right.
People often forget that that's also a positive because it shows other folks that you're standing up and willing to take a stand, not just be compliant. And so you have many organizations have lawyers, but yet we're afraid to use them when we're in the right. Many organizations have people who can sit down and write up all of these different laws, rules, procedures, but they don't want to do it because they don't want to go through the perception of it. But if they get sued, which is compliance, not actual culture, it's, okay, we did this.
Yeah, that culture change happens in companies. I'm often struck by when I ask managers, what are you trying to achieve? And they'll tell me culture change. I'm always puzzled by that because I'm an expert in that field. And to me, culture is a consequence of shared experience, the shared experience of the workers and managers of a company. And if they have a good experience, then they want to do more of that. If they have a bad experience from something, they want to do less of that.
Mm-hmm.
So culture is the result of shared experience. So if we want to shape culture, we have to change the experiences people get. In short, we have to live what we're talking about. We have to walk the walk
Right.
as well as talk the talk.
Right. And when we're walking that, we got to make sure that we're in other people's shoes.
Yeah.
We talk about, like, Doc, when you talk about making sure that we're walking the walk, not only are we doing it, but we're aligning so we're not forgetting. We're aligning so that we're not putting our values above somebody else's, that we're appreciative of where people coming from, and just trying to be not sympathetic, because oftentimes in diversity, we talk about sympathy. We don't want sympathy, right? Empathy, understanding. And then if you don't understand, being able to ask and having that safe space. Like we've been talking about what? Courageous conversations almost 2 years ago, 2 years now, right? We're having a courageous conversation. It's not courageous, they're necessary. They're necessary conversations to understand so you get better, so I get better. We all get the understanding.
Excellent. And also, despite investing $8 billion each year on diversity and inclusion training, according to Harvard Business Review, 40% of workers still feel isolated at work.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see about that? And there must be something missing. And we talk a lot about as belongings. And how do you see the context, and how do you see the fit in the context?
I think because it's a forced march, and I know what that term means, and I know the implications of it, and I mean it's forced. Like, so if I do a diversity training or a diversity talk, right? Because I try not to say training too much. I see the folks in the back of the room, like it's worse than being in class. They come, they have their newspaper, they have their phone out, or they're talking with their buddies, and so you know who I go to talk to first, right? There's no bigger bully in the classroom than whoever's in the front. So I go and I say, hey, what do you want to talk about? Because here's the thing, when you talk about this $8 billion industry, it is that. Everybody can't do it, but everybody thinks they can. And then when you're telling people, hey, come to work, the person in the front of the room is the person that they're looking at and they're like, it's all right, I don't have to do this. I'm here because, like, I know an institution that makes people do diversity trainings online. And all a lot of people do is hit a button and they keep scrolling through. But if you engage the people, you actually talk to them. What do you want to learn? Right? Whenever you go in to do an education situation or a talk, what do you want to know? Mm-hmm. Right? Because you have to do some talking up front, but then you stop. What do you want to know? What's important to you? And if this isn't important, raise your hand.
See, that's a bottom-up approach. That's an organization development approach to training, to learning from each other. And you're also living the idea of diversity by opening up to what the people want to talk about rather than what you want to talk about.
What's important is what you impart, right? When you say the word teacher or professor, you want to be a teacher because you want to teach. You don't necessarily want to be a professor because you don't want to profess. You don't want to just run off at the mouth. You don't want to just talk. You want to be engaged. So how better to teach you than to ask you what you want to know? And like I said, those people in the back of the room, the difficult manager, the hard manager, when they're like, I got it. I've got a friend that's Black. I got a friend that's gay. I'm married. My mother was a woman. Okay, great. How are you treating them in the workplace? What are they going? Why are they retiring? Why are they? Because people forget retiring is also quitting. Why are they retiring unless you're giving them like the super great compensation package? But why are they retiring? Why are they leaving? Why are people turning away from your organization?
Very interesting. Dr. Rothwell, if you don't have any feedback on that, we would like to talk about the framework that you have developed, the excellent framework, and how does that help to prioritize DEI&B contribution to an organization's ability to adapt, evolve, and even remain competitive in the future?
Focus was providing an action manual that would help someone who did not have a lot of experience in setting up corporate culture change efforts, and who may have been handed the responsibility of setting up and launching a DE&I program of some kind, and give them the a framework to use in order to do that. And we wanted to follow the logic of organization development, where we regard the people as the expert and the consultant or the manager as a facilitator who uses questioning as a way to get the people involved in making their own decisions. So we came up with a 10-step model. I'll read off the steps just so you have an idea of the direction we took. The first step was define the organization's corporate culture, and that's harder than it sounds. Get clear on the current situation. Then in step 2, clarify the role of DE&I in shaping that culture. What do people think? And again, we're not relying solely on top managers' opinion here. We're listening to voices at all levels, because that's what diversity is all about, is being sensitive to the fact that for different groups, perception is reality.
Absolutely.
So in step 3, we clarify who has the authority to change culture. So who are the stakeholders? Who are the major decision makers in the organization? Who controls the levers of power and the resources of the organization? Then in step 4, identify and define talent pipelines. Where do people come from and where do people go in the organization? That's important when we're talking about all aspects of human resources: recruiting, selection, onboarding, training, development, praising, rewarding, using corrective action, all of those HR issues that are not just under the responsibility of HR, but are actually the job of all employees in organizations. In step 5, we talked about how do you develop talent in the organization, and that can vary depending on the corporate culture. In step 6, we talked about navigating emotions and other relational dynamics. And that's very important. How do people relate to each other? How does belonging fit into the organization? What is the corporate climate as well as the culture? In step 7, we talked about showcasing organizational talent. One of the ways you advance in any organization is by getting visibility. So how do we get diverse groups to have visibility with those people in power? Step 8, how do you promote your organization's talent? When we say promote, we don't just mean help them move up the organization chart. We mean, how do we help them become more visible? And that will, by nature, accelerate the development of people who are well qualified, but who might be overlooked. In step 9, we talk about developing employee resource groups, a topic Jamie might want to talk a little more about. And then in step 10, that all-important step of evaluating based on the targets we set in our definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility in step 1, and the metrics we've established and how they align to the company's strategic business goals. Then in step 10, if you set your targets in a clear, measurable way in step 1, then we can easily evaluate results in step 10. But if you don't know what you want in step 1, you don't know what you'll get in step 10. And that's true not just of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, but that's true of any HR program or change effort. So Jamie, do you want to say a few words about employee resource groups, which are pretty important in the DE&I space?
Yeah, and they're important for several reasons, and I'll try to give some really quick. So when you talk about an ERG, employee resource group, a business resource group, or an affinity group, many organizations use any of those three terms. It is because you're trying to get people to come together from select backgrounds to talk about issues that may affect them. What's also important to know about these affinity groups is that anyone can belong. Now, what you have to be careful about in developing these affinity groups is making sure that people aren't coming in with silver bullets, or people aren't coming in and feeling like they can't speak out. In looking at how employee resource groups do, you'll see different companies operate different ways. And then you'll also hear people say, well, I don't want to go because, John may be in there. And John is a supervisor that's of a different either race or ethnicity or different background altogether. So you have to be careful with them to some degree. But when organizations use these ERGs effectively, this means that people can come, people from the C-suite, from the management suite, come and talk to the president of the women's affinity group, or come and talk to the head of the Hispanic BRG to get ideas on what's going on and how they can be better supportive of those communities within the organization. They're not something where they're looking at as antagonistic or something that is just totally opposite. They also are places where you can create the organic mentoring. So when you talk about these groups, it doesn't mean that they're forced in. You opt in. And so sometimes you have the senior folks who are there say, okay, well, I've been at this company 30 years and this is how I've survived. And that's what people want to hear who are just getting in. And the fact that they may look like the person in front of them, because representation still matters. Mm-hmm. It makes it easier for them to have these conversations. And so those employee resource groups become a necessary tool for the organization to survive. Remember, I said diversity and sustainability are hand in hand. These are this piece. This is that piece of that sustainability, that idea of growing into the organization.
Jamie, if I'm a tough-minded manager, the first question I'm going to ask, because many organizations today are understaffed. I mean, they've downsized to the point they can't even get today's job done with the staff they've got. And if I'm a tough-minded manager, the first question I'm going to ask is, am I expected to release my staff to employee resource groups during working hours? Or is there some way we can either pay them for overtime out of HR's budget, or can we have that done on their own time? How would you answer that tough-minded question? And so, managers will ask that.
Well, that's why I started laughing, because I think that's one of the things that we deal with even today. Because when you talk about it, manager always saying, well, I need you on this job for this 8 hours. You're giving your employee an hour, one hour, maybe once a month. For their mental sanity, that might be the only break that they get. 2, when you talk about pay them overtime, if you say, if you go after 5 o'clock, I will pay you overtime to do it. You just can't do it during the day. That might be a viable option. Mm-hmm. Are they paying them out of HR budget? We're not going to do that. Paying them out of HR's budget, that's something new, right? These ERGs often don't have budgets. So they're getting money from HR just to establish what they're trying to do. Oftentimes you can say, hey, we'll do it at lunch. Remember, I said this is an opt-in thing. So they may opt in for lunch, they may opt in for using email, but even when that tough-minded manager is saying, I don't have enough people on the floor, I don't have enough people at the desk, then you start to talk about how are these people feeling? Because that one time that they go to that affinity group, might be their time to release, to relax and say, okay, tell me what I'm missing because I got to deal with Jamie and he's a hard case. How do I help get through to him? You may have somebody, oh yeah, I worked with him before. He just wants you to do X, Y, Z. Oh, then I go do X, Y, then you do X, Y, Z, and then Jamie's warm and fuzzy. But then you say, okay, well, there's too much time away. And oh my God, what some managers are concerned about, are they talking about me? And they might very well be, but that comes to self-reflection. Why are they talking about you? And then you have to say, okay, I'm going to give them this hour so they can be engaged. What happens with their productivity? Does their productivity go up? Because some managers say, well, that's just a reason for them to complain. Okay, complaining can be therapeutic. Complaining, if it's allowed to come out, if it's allowed to say, here are some solutions. So yeah, so there are different ways to go about it. There are different ways to work with even because you said tough-minded manager. I need a rational, tough-minded manager. I need a fair-minded, tough, because you can be tough all day. But if you're fair, we can come up with a solution. If you're just doing it because you don't believe in it, then I got to work through some other things. I got to understand why you don't.
And it may well be a values issue that goes to the very base of appreciating diversity efforts. Mm-hmm. So that may be a symptom of a bigger problem.
Right. And we have to understand what the reason is, because if they're saying it's just a timing thing, we can work through time.
All right. Sounds good. Farhan, do you have other questions for us?
We do have a lot more question and I'm pretty sure our audience wants to hear a lot more, but because of the time constraint, we have to wrap up and we just want to hear some last thoughts, some tips and advices that you can share for our listeners.
Okay, well, maybe I'll start that. And of course, we're excited about this series of books we've been working on. We believe that can be helpful to people. The first book, again, is about how we can apply bottom-up change principles, hearing the voices of all of our workers and managers, and then shaping our diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility efforts around what people care about in unique corporate cultures and unique national cultures. So that's my thoughts, and we just want to be helpful and make the world a better place. Jamie, any of your final thoughts?
I think when Dr. Rothwell talks about going beyond, where each step we're taking a further step, so we're looking at how we do things globally, how we're doing things across the waters, and how we can engage from being sometimes domestically based, but understanding how to think globally but act locally. So we want to keep that engagement going. But I want to make sure that we understand when we're doing things in a diversity space, it is about engagement, and it's not about talking. It's really about listening and understanding, and respect is never a part of this equation. We hope that it is. It's nice if it is, but it's about the respect. It's about the understanding.
Great talk. And I'm pretty sure it increases the understanding of the listeners as much as it did to me. So thank you for all the kind words and the concept that you have shared with us. And that's a wrap for our today's talk on HR, unpacking trends and talent innovation. Stay curious, stay innovative, and we'll catch you in our next episode.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.